Shalom Erev Tov, and welcome to Cinema at War Part 2. This is being recorded and will be available for people who have subscribed to it. It will be available to people who have subscribed to it and be online at EBIJFF.org. Before I give a more formal introduction about the lecture, I will note that it is being sponsored by the Independent Jewish World Cinema, which is the parent organization of the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival, in partnership with Contra Costa Jewish Community Center and Congregation B'nai Shalom and Diablo Valley Hadassah. And now tonight's program. Several months ago, we explored the first part of Cinema at War, which dealt with America's censorship code, sometimes called the Code of the Hayes Office, which was put into effect in 1934, and how the censorship laws, especially Article 10, which I'll talk about a bit later, very briefly, help shape the films that the Hollywood studios would or could make from 1934, basically until 1939, when the studios just didn't pay as much attention to Article number 10 because of what was happening around the world with World War II. Today, we're going to look at not what Hollywood did, but how Hollywood was manipulated by the Third Reich's Ministry of Enlightenment. It's a bad word for what it did, but it was called Enlightenment and Propaganda. And that was led by Joseph Paul Goebbels, who really wanted to control all aspects of culture in Nazi Germany. So we're going to begin, and hopefully we tried this before and it didn't always work, but I think it will today. Let me just move this over here. Thank you. As I just mentioned, the last lecture dealt with the American film industry's acceptance of a production code. I'm not going to go into all the different articles. Some of them are ridiculous, such as even a married couple had to keep one foot on the floor if they were in the same bed. But there was a very serious article, Article 10, which, and I'll be glad to read it, the rights, history, and feelings of any nation are entitled to be considered and respected in the films. And without the okay from the censorship czar himself, we'll talk about him later, the movies from whatever studio could not get the certificate or seal of approval, which you see there. And without that, most decent-sized and especially large theaters, whether Paramount, Fox, Lowe's, whatever was in existence in the 30s, would not show that Hollywood film. But our real story today doesn't deal that much with the code, though it did have an effect, but with the stormtroopers or brown shirts. And it begins on December 4th, 1930. If you think of December 30th, 1930, you realize that the Nazis were not yet in power. Still, they began to try to push and manipulate the culture of their country by trying to ban movies and books and other cultural documents, art pieces, radio broadcasts, etc., to make the German audience, the people of Germany, the citizens of Germany, begin to think their way, that their values, their spirit was correct. So on that day, they raged into Mozart Hall in Berlin, where an American film was being shown. Believe it or not, they threw up in the air something called sneeze powder, which actually exists, though I don't know if anyone uses it today, stink bombs, and released white mice into the theater in order to end the showing of the film, and hoping that the audience would run away with all these horrible things going on. Goebbels, who is shown at the bottom of the screen, shouted out, Judenfilm, Judenfilm, obviously Jew film. He believed that, of course, Hollywood was controlled by Jews, and Jews wanted to humiliate Germany, despite hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Germany and fighting in World War I for their country. He believed that there was a conspiracy to destroy the German people, and that was going to be not only through financial reasons, but also through the control of Hollywood and the American film industry. The film, which they did not like, I'm referring to the Nazis, you may say, why didn't they like this film? It was All Quiet on the Western Front, based on a book written just a few years earlier, and which had already, by 1940, had been read around the world by millions and millions of people and won many awards. Why didn't Goebbels and Hitler and other Nazi leaders like this film? I'm going to have people share, since we don't have a huge number. If you want to raise your hand or just unmute yourself, why do you think that All Quiet on the Western Front, it was produced by Universal Studios, why do you think the Nazis didn't like this film? Did it make fun of Hitler? Yes. Sue.
Well, Germany lost. I mean, it was the truth, right? It was like the harshest truth about war, you know.
It was an anti-war film, you're correct. And the Nazis wanted to glorify war. They were thinking ahead of getting more breathing space. And they did not want a German population that thought the way that the film would lead people to, which was war was bad, it was muddy trenches, it was rancid food, it was a senseless dying of people. And that was part of the book, or a major part of the book, and certainly the film captured that very, very graphically. They wanted only films that would go along with the Nazi ideology and the values that they wanted to inculcate in the population. Okay, just.
Riva,
This is just, yeah.
Sherry's hand is up, so.
I couldn't see her, sorry. Sherry, go ahead, say something.
That's okay. My point was that since Germany lost the war and was seen in a very bad light, they couldn't have liked it very much, because it was about the First World War and the hopelessness of the war and how terrible
Yes.
it was, with all that was destroyed, all the people killed, of course, and all the people that lived wounded and suffering for the rest of their lives after that war.
Thank you, yes. They did not like the element of defeatism, and it was the Nazi belief that the German military in World War I, and this is a scene you can see here from the movie, the 1930 movie. The film was made twice more, just recently as well. And they thought that the German military would have succeeded in winning the war had people not given up so quickly, and that there was an element of defeatism within the German population. And this is a line from the film, which was stated by the young protagonist, Paul, who came into the war, signed up, very, very enthusiastic and patriotic, and at the end was very disillusioned. And from the film, it is dirty and painful to die for the fatherland. That is not something that Hitler wanted, as he had a vision for a future war in Europe or with some other, against some other countries. After the initial closing, Goebbels and the stormtroopers went, as I said, to other theaters, and eventually the film was pulled from the German market, not because the Weimar Republic, which was in 1930 the government, but because they were afraid of safety for film goers, fearing what was the next step for the stormtroopers. Were they going to beat people up? Were they were going to set the theater on fire? Eventually, however, the salesperson in Berlin for Universal Studios recommended to the Hollywood office that they should cut certain scenes, including this line, and therefore maybe it would become acceptable to those who are causing trouble. And indeed, that's what happened. 8 cuts were made to the 1930 film. And at that time, that made the film not perfect for Goebbels and Hitler, but at least more acceptable. And they didn't have the power they would later have after Hitler became chancellor. So Hollywood began already in 1930 to capitulate, to give in. And actually, they had begun to capitulate to many countries, even as early as 1914, 1910. Does anyone imagine why they would make films and then cut certain scenes according to the desires of different countries? Why would that be important, that the film could go to Japan or go to England or Mexico? Yeah. Sue, Sue?
Well, I believe that it's that Hollywood was kind of struggling. It's hard to imagine because they're so powerful now, but they were struggling at that time, and they wanted to increase their success.
Well, even in the early days, they were struggling, because imagine a Hollywood without DVDs or streaming or movies in hotels or, a TV set in your home. There weren't that many opportunities to get a film that was only going to play in America to bring in enough money. It is estimated that over the years, half the revenue of a Hollywood studio, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, came from overseas sales. And therefore, making sure that there weren't kissing scenes in a Hollywood movie, even chaste kissing scenes in a Hollywood movie, at the turn of the last century or before World War I started, could be cut from a Hollywood film that went to Japan, or that they would make fewer films with so-called, quote, Mexican bandits. The Mexican government complained that in the early years of Hollywood, many of the so-called villains, in quotation marks, were citizens of Mexico, and they felt that was stereotyping and wrong. So they began to reduce the percentage of films where there were Mexican, quote, bandits. Now, Hollywood, in 1930, we have the Depression. And for many, many Americans, it was food or film. So they may not go to the movies. At one time, there were 80 million Americans who went to the movies, not during the year, but every week. So if you can imagine relying on that many millions to see films and having the Depression slash the percentages, it was important, however immoral or unethical it was, to cater to foreign countries. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to wait a minute and I'm going to stop sharing. So the cuts were made. Carl Laemmle, who was the head of Universal Studios, and a Jew from Germany, a small town, agreed to them, because at the time, no one really thought that Hitler would become head of Germany. Later on, even after that happened, and horrible things like the Nuremberg laws, and Jews not being considered citizens in Germany, kicked out of professions, including the film industry. Even then, while Warner Brothers left the market in Germany, not trying to sell their films there, as well as RKO. Universal continued. By that time, Laemmle began to lose control of Universal and then was no longer in charge, but Paramount continued as long as it possibly could, as well as MGM. So studios remained there, even though many of their executives and some of the owners of the studio, the chief executives, were Jewish. It was, we look back, of course, most of us were not alive at the time, but it was a lot of dark times when the money trumped the morality of the, no political mention of that, money was more important to keep the studios alive rather than the morality of staying in a country regarding sales where Jews could no longer make films. So Goebbels and Hitler, like Stalin and Lenin, they all loved cinema. They all thought cinema was very, very powerful as a tool for propaganda, as a tool for shaping people's ideology, feelings, and activities. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, and I'm going to have to read it so I get his exact words, "The picture in all of its forms, the visuals, in other words, including films, have greater possibilities in shaping people's minds. Here, a man, or we should add a woman, or anyone, needs to use his brains, her brains, their brains, even less. It suffices to look, or at most to read, extremely brief text. And thus, many more will more readily accept a pictorial presentation or film than read an article of any length." In other words, you can affect people's minds, thinking processes, patriotism, willingness to go to war, support a fascist government because of a film or visuals. And Hitler, unfortunately, and Albert Speer and Goebbels and others were very, very effective in using visuals, especially at rallies, large flags with swastikas on them, a lot of red and black colors in the arena or place where the rallies took place, torches of fire, which were very dramatic. And thus propaganda became very, unfortunately, effective. As one reviewer of All Quiet on the Western Front in the United States, it still exists today, I'm pretty sure, the Hollywood Reporter said that Goebbels was obsessed with fanning a militaristic spirit in the German population. And that could not be done with all of the horrors of war that you could see in All Quiet on the Western Front. When eventually, as I said, the film was allowed back into the German theaters, Goebbels, who often wrote for German newspapers, those on the right, had as one of the headlines of his article, "Victory is ours," one step closer to controlling the culture, the film, the radio broadcasts of Germany. The book All Quiet on the Western Front, just as an aside, was burnt along with many other banned books in May of 1933, once the Nazis had begun to really take a firm hold on the unfortunate country, which now was going to have not a very liberal cinema or art, which the Nazis thought was degenerate during the Weimar Republic, but something that was very controlled to present a certain very limited picture of how Germans should act. And by Germans, they did not mean Jews or the Romana peoples or whoever they didn't consider Aryan. We're now going to talk. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Yep. And just move it down. So the Nazis were going to use film as well as art and music and literature and buildings, architecture as propaganda. Now you see this visual here. It's a World War I poster. And it's very, you may have seen it sometime in your life. I want you for the United States Army. It was for recruitment in World War I. And you can Google yourself or whatever search engine you want to use. I don't have stock in Google, but whatever you want to use. And if you say World War I posters, you will see hundreds of posters. You can actually buy some of them that are reprinted. This is a form of propaganda, according to those who have classified it. It is making Americans at the time patriotic. This was another American propaganda poster. And this one from San Francisco, even a dog enlists, why not you? We often think of propaganda as lies, misinformation, but it also can be thought of as something positive to encourage you to think that way or do something. However, it also can create fear. And some Australian posters, this is the leader of Germany at the time of World War I, and trying to get Australians who enlisted in the hundreds of thousands to enlist. And there was great tragedy in the Gallipoli battle, but we're not going to go into that now. There was a movie made about it. And here he has the German leader trying to take over Australia. So that is also propaganda to create fear. This is another one. It's for the United States Army. And here is this gorilla, this ape, wearing a helmet, which is of the German army. And at that time, people would recognize, and it's culture spelled with a K, that this is Germany. And this is the symbol of, which is not very politically correct today, of the American woman, blonde-haired, Caucasian, etc. And he, the German animal, is going to do something very unpleasant to the face of the American woman. It's also a little bit sexual here. And this is another poster from Australia where German names were put on top of Australian names for cities. So another one of that. The reason I bring this up is that Goebbels, who would in 1933, just a few months after Hitler became chancellor, became head of the Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda. Very obvious, they want to do propaganda, which we know was not enlightening, but they called it that. Some of the censors, some of the film people, there were many thousands in his ministry after a few years, were very upset with this American film and did not want it to go into into Germany. This was a 1933 RKO movie, King Kong. I remember seeing it, not when it came out, but on TV as a kid, many decades later. And of course, there you have the same imagery of a big, gigantic ape, though he's not wearing a helmet, and this Aryan-looking woman. So why do you think, and you could raise your hand, Goebbels and some of the censors did not want it to be shown or even admitted to theaters? Well, here's the quote. They had actually interviews with people in the Third Reich who were involved with health and medicine, etc. And a Professor Zeiss, when asked, was this film going to hurt people, especially children and women? Because that was what they used to ask. the weaker people in society, according to the propaganda ministry. He said, and you could read it as well, "I am astounded and shocked. This film is nothing less than an attack on the nerves of the German people." He goes on to say, "It provokes our racial instincts to show a blonde woman of the Germanic type in the hand of an ape." I won't continue, you could read it yourself. However, there was a problem. Not everyone agreed. And the film was shown in Nazi Germany. By then, the Nazis were in control of letting films in or not. And especially because King Kong for that year was Hitler's favorite film. Hitler was a film buff, and according to many biographies and film histories, he would watch before the war. I don't have information once the war started, but from 33 until 39, he would try to watch a film every night of the week, and including many Hollywood films. And obviously, he didn't think he would be negatively affected by this movie. What type of films would they want, Goebbels and Hitler? Obviously, for the German-made films, they wanted films that could promote the Nazi Party, show Hitler in a very good light, show the values of the Nazi Party and of the Third Reich, and the superiority of the Aryan so-called race. Foreign films could not just come into the country. There were very strict quotas, so many foreign films compared to how many films were made in Germany. So the studios around the world, but especially in Hollywood, because they made most of the films at the time that were coming to Germany, wanted to make sure that their films were acceptable and would not be kicked out. There was an Article 15 that was voted on even before Hitler took power, which said that if films were unacceptable by the German censors, all of the films of that studio, and they didn't name Warner Brothers or Universal, but generally whatever studio outside of Germany, all of the films could be banned. So if you had one film which was a taboo film, a banned film, all your films may not get into the country. And American films, as I said, were very popular. Magazines, which is sort of the equivalent, was it Photoplay when I was a kid, or People magazine today, often had Hollywood stars, and these are German periodicals I meant to reference, often had Hollywood stars on the cover, not just German actors and actresses. And there were long lines outside the theaters to get into a Hollywood film. This brought in a very large amount of money at a very difficult time. So how did Goebbels deal with making sure that Hollywood films were correct according to the Nazi thought process? Well, here he is, George. This keeps on happening, and I keep on typing in the correct spelling, and somehow my computer is stuck on Gosling. They must like that actor. In any event, he was Gisling. Here he is smiling. According to certain sources online, he actually couldn't stand Hitler, but he did his duty and was sent to Los Angeles to be a consul in the German consulate there, with the purpose to educate and guide, you might say blackmail, collaborate with the studios and with the American film lobby, MPPDA, the Motion Picture Distributors and Producers of America. I will just call it MPPDA because it's too long otherwise. And to tell them how much better it would be for them to not make films that dealt with Nazi Germany or Italy's Mussolini, or criticized Hitler, or dealt with the anti-Semitic laws that would soon be passed in the Third Reich. He used Article 15 that I just talked about, and basically in a nice way threatened, if you make this film, not only won't this film get in, but all your films. And maybe not just for 1933 or 34, but maybe forever. So he would be able to read the scripts and suggest cuts. Sometimes when a film was already made, he'd be invited to a screening room at the studio, and with his pen and paper, write down things that he found objectionable to the Nazi cause. As one Nazi leader noted, prevention of disease is much better than treatment in a hospital. In other words, let's not have these films made at all to begin with. He didn't just work alone. He had, according to books on this period about cinema, a collaborator, this guy here, Joseph Ignatius Breen. I talked about him a few months ago. He was an American. He was a strict, very faithful Catholic, someone involved with the film lobby and writing and lobbying for several years. He also was an isolationist, which means he didn't want films to be made in America, which encouraged people to be angry at the Third Reich or Italy's, Mussolini's Italy, especially when Great Britain was moving into a warlike stance. He wanted America to stay neutral. And he also, according to many historians, and there's some quotes here, was anti-Semitic, even though he, on a day-to-day basis, would work with, communicate with Hollywood execs. Many of them, as you know, were Jewish. He had once said to a colleague, 95% of these folks, Hollywood executives, are Jews of an Eastern European lineage. They are probably the scum of the earth. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but as you know, 1930s was a time of great anti-Semitism in the United States. There were a lot of hate groups, including the Black Legion, the Silver Legion, and others, the Klan, who were very anti-Semitic, of course, anti-immigrant, anti-Black. And one of them, quoted here, William Dudley Pelley, was happy that Breen could censor films because that individual felt confident that Breen would prevent Hollywood from bringing America into a war. The studios themselves were very cognizant that there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and they, like many American Jews, and there have been many books about this as well, felt that you shouldn't try to push your own agenda too much, too aggressively, and not to talk about what was happening to your cousins, relatives back in Europe, starting in the Third Reich, then Austria, Czechoslovakia, etc. It wouldn't be good for American Jews because of the anti-Semitism. And I'm sure you know as well that Father Coughlin, called the Radio Priest, had his own show in which he proudly, publicly enunciated his anti-Semitic feelings. Today, I don't know if you've read the press, there was a major new law firm that was setting up across the United States. Two of the people who set up this law firm text each other on the company. They left another law firm and they text each other. This is 2023, some horrible things about African Americans, immigrants, women, and Jews. You can look it up. It was on a lot of the news feeds today. This still happens. Gissling and Breen worked together to bring the studios to, as I said, let Gissling read the scripts if the films had not yet been made, or to see an early version of them. And this is a film which he saw, was by Warner Brothers. They really were brothers who were the Warners. The most famous was Frank and Harry, who were very anti-Nazi, but this was early on, before all the horrible things began to penetrate. And then the Warner Brothers withdrew from the German market, but they allowed Ghislaine to see an early version of the film. And the film is about a German prisoner of war camp in World War I, in which the it's World War I, but the German commandant was very cruel to the British soldiers, would beat them, slap them in the face, and deprive them of water. And Ghislaine thought that did not portray Germany very well. And so the Warner Brothers cut scenes until the film was eventually considered okay for import into the Third Reich. We'll start sharing for a while. So the studios complied, and there were many films which are not made because of this collaboration. One such film was The Madman of Europe, which never got enough funding because the major studios who could have helped the independent producer would not help, fearing that they would get in trouble with Nazi Germany. You can imagine who the Madman of Germany was. They were not going to call him, it was a feature film, they were not going to call him Adolf Hitler. He was called in the script, it never was made, this film, Adolf Mittler. Rather obvious. It was never made, though, for years and years and years. Even after World War II began, the independent producers who wanted this film, it was one of the Mankiewicz brothers, who were quite famous at the time as screenwriters, tried and tried and tried, and no one really would fund them. Films which did have some sort of political element, like Idiot's Delight. Does anyone ever hear, you can raise your hand, anyone ever hear of the film or the play? The film Idiot's Delight had been a Pulitzer Prize winning play in the mid-90s. Oh yes, Sherry, you've heard of it? Sherry, you can unmute yourself.
That would have been war. It's a metaphor for war, wasn't it? Idiot's Delight.
And it was an anti-war film, and won a Pulitzer Prize. And the playwright for the rights to make it into a film had been paid $100,000. In the mid-1930s, this was astronomical. And when Ghislaine found out, and so did the Italian, because the Italian consulate in LA also got to learn about what Hollywood was going to make. When they heard about this film was anti-war, and originally Italy was going to be involved with trying to start a war, they went to Breen and they say, can you make sure that this film is never made? And Breen went to the studio and he said, I think it was MGM, but I have to check. And he said, listen, you can make the film, but cut out a little bit of the anti-Italian stuff, making them war hungry, and don't mention anything about Germany, and also change the title of the film, because the public, it was a very popular film, play. The public would have heard about this play, and therefore they will know that there's a connection. Call it something else. And they said, then why should we have spent $100,000 if we're changing everything? We're keeping it Idiot's Delight. But they did change a lot of the plot. Clark Gable was one of the main stars. They made it into more, there was a drama, but it had more romance and some comedy. And to make sure Italy was never connected to the film and Germany wasn't mentioned, one even though it was in English, they talked about that the language of the country they were in was Esperanto. And also, there was a train involved in the plot. It broke down and then it was fixed. That as they got on the train at one point, they had one of the characters say, "Now we go to Italy," to show that the things that Italy would not like done in their country were not done in Italy, because now they weren't even there. So things were tweaked quite a bit. When Warner Brothers, as I said, pulled out of the German market, but still, even though they promised and vowed to make a film that really showed what was happening in Nazi Germany, they were very shy about doing that. They made several films which were metaphors for what they wanted to do, including one of the early Robin Hood films, that being a metaphor for the evil Prince John and the wonderful democratic Robin Hood, and the concept of a totalitarian government, boo, and the democracy of Robin Hood and his merry men. With everyone in that movie knowing full well that it was a metaphor, but even Warner Brothers couldn't dare say Hitler or Goebbels or Heinrich or anyone. It had to be a fairy tale, so to speak. What else happened at this time? You might think that they would have, Nazi Germany made many films that were viciously anti-Semitic. The reality is they didn't. There were some films that had anti-Semitic tropes or caricatures of characters, stereotypes, but they were very careful not to overdo it until 1940, and World War II had already begun. Then they were very willing to do much more in regard to condemning Jews for being financial crooks, for molesters of Aryan women, for co-conspirators with Germany's enemies to defeat the Third Reich at war, whether it was World War I or World War II. Before we go into some of the films that were made, which were very strongly propaganda in nature by the Third Reich, a little bit what had happened to filmmakers. Beginning almost as soon as Hitler took power, all Jewish directors, producers, actors, backstage craftspeople who worked in the German film industry were fired. Over 2,000 of such people, maybe even more, were fired. If you were Jewish, you were out. If you had a Jewish spouse, you often usually were out as well. And sometimes if you were very, very popular, Goebbels would, or Hitler would make a decision, okay, we're not going to have you in a new movie, but you and your husband could stay in Berlin or Bonn or wherever you lived and not be deported. Sometimes, even if the actor who was non-Jewish had a Jewish wife and a child, and I'm going to share now again. Okay. Then you weren't safe. So there were several German filmmakers in jeopardy at this time because their spouses were not Jewish. A person was very popular, Henny, it was a woman's name, Horton, whose husband was not, she was not Jewish, her husband was Jewish, very, very popular and famous in the Third Reich, and for many years before. And so she was allowed to stay with her husband, but Gottschalk, who was a Christian or non-Jewish actor, was married to a Jew. Their child was being brought up as Jewish, a half-Jewish German. And after several years, the Nazis decided to deport Gottschalk's wife and also his child. He then, and it was a very famous case after World War II, a movie was made about it. They committed suicide, and the child also was killed. Made into a movie, as I said, after the war was over because of the needing to tell the story. Pictured above is Kurt Göran. He was Jewish. His wife, as far as I know, were Jewish. His parents were Jewish, not half and half. He wasn't a Mischling, but he thought he was looking at the tea leaves, looking at the crystal ball. Early on, he left Germany. He was an actor and a director. He was one of the first people to sing Mac the Knife, a very famous song at the time. To the right there, he is in one of the German movies with Marlene Dietrich. And he moved to Paris with his wife and his parents, thinking he was safe. He wasn't. But before he could be exiled, sent away, deported from France, from Paris, he went to Amsterdam, thinking he was safe. He wasn't. Unfortunately, a friend of his from Germany, do you remember Peter Lorre, the actor? Peter Lorre was now in America, along with Billy Wilder and many, many hundreds of German Jews who were able to get a visa. It wasn't easy, but this was much earlier on than after Kristallnacht. Peter Lorre, who already was an established name in Hollywood, said to him, "Why don't you come to America?" And he said, "No, I'm a European. I don't want to do that." And unfortunately, first his parents from Amsterdam were sent to the concentration camp Sobibor, and they died there. And then Göran and his wife were sent to Theresienstadt, or Terezins, another name for Theresienstadt, where often very famous Jews from Europe were sent rather than to Sobibor or Auschwitz or other camps. There he was forced to make a documentary and a film about how wonderful Theresienstadt was, which was going to be shown to neutral countries and the Red Cross, etc. And after the filmmaking was done, those on his crew and himself and his wife were sent to Auschwitz on the last train out of Theresienstadt, and he died in 1944 at that camp. Many of you may have seen the movie Casablanca, and many of the Germans in that film, which were, of course, Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart, were Germans, and they were Jewish, actually German Jews who had left Germany in time and were able to play Germans, Nazis, etc. in Hollywood films in the 30s and 40s. So there were films which were horribly anti-Semitic, two in particular. This was a documentary. This was the poster of the 1940 documentary, The Eternal Jew. A lot of the imagery in this film, and you can see here that the Jew is a communist, but on the other hand, he has money in his hand. So he's also a capitalist. He can be either. He can be very cruel. There's sort of a whip or a cane here. And also he could be religious. You never knew who the Jew was, who you would meet. Another poster was this one, using very stereotypical images. And one of the most horrific images was, and obviously this is a very old film and I couldn't get very clear photographs, Jews depicted as rats, teams, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of rats, with the understanding in the film or the misinformation that Jews spread like rats from country to country and dominate the world. They do not have, this shall be shown in the next film, Jude Zeus, that you don't know who the Jew is. They could be a capitalist, they could be a communist, they could be anyone, and they can be disguised. So you can be talking to someone, make a relationship with them, but you don't really know who they are, and they don't have loyalty to the country in which they're born or in which they live. This film was later banned after World War II. But another film which I was able to purchase, but unfortunately it only came yesterday, so I didn't have a chance to see it, is Jude Zeus, or the Jew Zeus. His name in the film, it's a feature film. It's trying to pass as a historic drama, and it contains similar imagery, not of rats, but the concept of the Jew doesn't belong anywhere. The Jew only cares about other Jews and is unethical, greedy, seduces women, rapes one of the main female characters, etc. And with Goebbels saying, an anti-Semitic film of the kind we could only wish for. I am happy for it. These are some scenes from the film. The film, according to film critics, was very well done as a film, not the content, but it was a very popular film. And after World War II, the Allied forces banned it from being shown because they felt it had been so effective in turning the German population against its own Jewish citizenry. I'm going to pass this because we're running out of time. Another type of propaganda film, which they weren't really being made until World War II started in Europe, were films that were anti-British. For a long time, Hitler really did not want to go to war with Great Britain and hoped that Great Britain would side with the Third Reich. But once the war started, they began to make a few anti-British films under Goebbels' guidance. This was The Heart of the Queen, about Elizabeth I and her mistreatment of, who do you think it is? You can just shout it out. Mary, Queen of Scots. And the concept was if England or Great Britain should be so cruel to a neighbor, to part of the British Empire as Scotland, what do you think Great Britain would do to you, Germans, Austrians, etc.? After the war, this film was also banned for a long time. One of the most famous propaganda films was the 1934 film. Anyone guess what it is? Triumph of the Will. You can see it probably on YouTube. I have a copy, but I didn't get permission to show it, even a little clip. So, but here are some scenes. The film was made as a documentary of the 6th Nazi Party Congress held in Nuremberg. The director only had a few films under her belt. It was Leni Riefenstahl, a very popular name in German cinema, a relatively young woman. She had originally started as a dancer, but became very famous with this film. Goebbels was very jealous of her because he thought he was in charge of all the film making in Germany. Not that he would direct it, but he would decide this and that. But Hitler chose her. And he was very annoyed and began to spread the rumor that she was Jewish, which she wasn't. But that, of course, would have lowered people's esteem for her in Nazi Germany. This is one of the scenes which shows the massive power of the Nazi German military and, you know, the power, the might, the unity at the Congress. And here are scenes, and there's scenes after scenes with especially young women raising their hand in a salute, carrying swastika banners and flags, and doing the salute to the messianic leader Adolf Hitler. The women are always seen to be adoring, and the men usually very militaristic in this quasi-documentary. It really was a propaganda piece, and Leni Riefenstahl actually began working on it with film footage of Nuremberg, cutting in with pictures of people raising their hand in salutes several months before. Great resources were given to her because she often shot from above, as you can see in the bottom picture. And let me see if I have a picture. No, I don't, but yes, I do. This is a shot with Hitler from below, but also they have pictures of him looking down on him, and she cut between all sorts of different directions and interspersed things that happened before he arrived in Nuremberg, that happened afterwards, to make a compelling, unfortunately, film showing him as all-powerful, almost godlike. One of the eeriest parts of the film is seeing Hitler in a small plane arriving in Nuremberg as his plane cut through the clouds, and then seeing Nuremberg below the plane itself. This is a picture of Leni, and this is a poster that was used at the time. Again, showing unity, showing Hitler, he's here at the bottom, the militaristic stance of this image, and very effective, unfortunately, very dangerous. And this is a little bit of a afternote. The film was very well received. It won an award or 2 or 3. And then in 1936, she was allowed by Hitler to make a documentary called Olympia, after the 1936 Olympics in the Third Reich. It was again a propaganda piece to show the might, the athletic successes of Germany. It took a while for her to finish the film, and in November 1938, she arrived on the ocean liner, the Europa, on the East Coast. Why is that month and year important? Well, it was Kristallnacht. She came just a few days before Kristallnacht. She didn't really know, presumably, what had taken place, the carnage, the loss of life, the destruction of Jewish stores, etc. And when questioned by journalists, because she was well known, well, what happened at Kristallnacht? She said, oh, there was no violence. That didn't really endear her to many journalists who felt that she was lying. Originally, the press had called her such things as Hitler's honey, Hitler's film czarina, Hitler's emissary in skirts, etc. Later, some not very nice words were used about her, as it became obvious that Kristallnacht was an obscene, heinous crime. When she arrived, there was a group called by the acronym HANL, the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. It was a group of people. Melvyn Douglas is one of the founders. He was Jewish, a noted actor at the time. And they were not all Jews, a lot of non-Jews as well, but who joined to try to convince studios, if they could, to show films, make films, which didn't hide the reality of the Third Reich, but also they did ads and contacted people to not welcome Leni Riefenstahl into their studios. They did not want the studios to purchase the rights to show Olympia or to just meet with her. And almost none of the studios did. There were a few people not noted for their warm relations with American Jews, including this man over here, who's obvious. Walt Disney met with her and showed her information about his new film, Fantasia, which was either just being made or was going to soon come out. Hedda Hopper met with her, and also a leading anti-Semite who reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and put them at his Ford car distributor shops, hard to say that, in just after World War I, Henry Ford. Avery Brundage, who was the head of the Olympic Committee for America, also met with her. So she met with people who were welcoming, but a lot of people did not welcome her at all. And she left without the film being really appreciated by Hollywood. Okay, just let me know. I'll go back to gallery. Excuse me. Okay, so a few afternotes. Leni Riefenstahl later on lived, I think, to 102. The question always was with German Third Reich filmmakers, if they made films which were anti-Semitic, encouraged the Holocaust, were anti-British, etc., should they be found guilty in a court? In other words, did what they did, was it being a collateral? Did it help? And therefore they should go to trial along with any of the people who showed up at Nuremberg or other European courts. As far as I know, the answer was no. Leni Riefenstahl did not go, or others, to Nuremberg or other places. It was like, I just made a film. I didn't actually carry out some of the things in it. Two things, the Triumph of the Will, no, sorry, excuse me, take it back. The film All Quiet on the Western Front would be made 3 times. The 1930 version, which won 2 early Oscars. It was only the 2nd year of the Academy Awards. It won Best Picture and Best Director. Then later on, around 1979, there was a television series. I never saw that one. I did see the 1930 film, which is available on DVD and maybe some streaming platforms. And the last one, which came out last year and won 4 Oscars. So if you can see one of them, it'll bring you back to the beginnings of Goebbels and others trying to control German culture, and how they were unfortunately successful until the end of the Third Reich. About the end of the Third Reich, of course, Goebbels was in the bunker with Hitler. Hitler committed suicide, but before he did so, he named Goebbels his successor. But Goebbels couldn't stand to live without the Fuhrer alive, and maybe realized that, like in World War I, Germany was going to be defeated again. The Soviet military was just about to penetrate, and maybe he could have escaped, or maybe he couldn't. And as you may know, he committed suicide. They're not sure whether or not his wife committed suicide or he killed her and their children, all of whom were in the bunker at the time. When Soviet soldiers came into the bunker area, they found Goebbels' diary, and it was hidden under many sheets of paper, writings, etc. And some of those were film scripts about films that he had hoped to make if the military in the Third Reich has succeeded. Anyhow, thank you very, very much. And I'm open for questions.
you know, Hollywood, it's so difficult, to take their complacent or their enabling, posture that, it's just hard for me to know how to feel about that. On the one hand, they survived, but on the other hand, they just like they sold so much to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of books on this subject. Some are nicer to Hollywood, some are not as nice. One calls it Hitler's Collaborators. There's a very positive book about Warner Brothers, but not so positive about the other studios. There's truth there in some of the books, some is more exaggerated. In 1940, 1939, it began to change because the reality of what was happening was, very obvious. And also, once war began, not as many American films were let into the German market.
Yeah,
So
there wasn't the
the
big
monetary plus about the arrangement, the studios felt a bit better or more inclined to make films that dealt with Nazi Germany. One film, these are before we entered the war, came out I'm pretty sure in 1940 by MGM. Even though war had already started in Europe, MGM still was very reluctant to really state what was happening. And the film was The Mortal Storm. You may be able to see it or not. The Mortal Storm starred Margaret Sullivan, Jimmy Stewart, Robert Young, Robert Stack, and also the actor who played the Wizard of Oz. I'm not sure what his name was. Henry Morgan, was it Henry Morgan? I'm not sure.
I don't know.
In the film, it starts with a Dr. Roth having his birthday. He looks like he's 70, but he's supposed to be only 50 in it. And everyone is cheering him at the medical school. And later it's January, I think, the end of January, presumably when the election was in 1933 for who was going to rule Germany. And they're at the dinner table. Robert Young is going to be engaged to his daughter, the doctor's daughter, her good friend who is very left-leaning and a veterinary student is Jimmy Stewart, who's one of the heroes. Robert Stack and that's Jimmy Stewart. Robert Stack and Robert Young, too many Roberts, are stormtroopers basically, though their father is Dr. Roth.
Wow.
Presumably their stepfather, but connected. The wife is presumably not Jewish, but she has children from the second marriage, the first marriage, and they're all around the table with a cake, and the maid comes in, happy, beaming. Hitler's going to be chancellor. Isn't this wonderful? Isn't this great? I'm almost repeating her exact words. And they're all smiling except Margaret Sullivan, Jimmy Stewart, the wife, and Dr. Roth. And the wife says, what's going to happen to you? A non-Aryan. They couldn't even say the word Jew in 1940 because they were fearful. And of course, he is sent to a concentration camp. At the end of the film, Margaret Sullivan and Jimmy Stewart, she is broken up with Robert Young because she sees that really he's a committed Nazi. And they are skiing down the Alps with Robert Young after them and his other stormtroopers. And I won't say exactly what happens, but at the very last scene, as I forget all the characters, Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan are together, and I don't remember what happens to the stormtroopers. Maybe there was an avalanche or maybe not. You hear church bells in the background as they reach Switzerland.
Oh.
So they have to put in what is called a Christological element. Not that they reached a synagogue or someone from the resistance, but it was church bells. Nothing wrong with church bells, but they had to reduce the Jewish aspect of the film.
Right.
And it was a popular film at the time. The one film which really, I think it advertised itself as this film calls a Nazi, or something like that, was the Warner Brothers docudrama, Confessions of a Nazi Spy. And the only reason why something that was very heavy hitting and very, very truthful about Nazi spies on the Northeast was, it was a true story. The FBI ferreted out and brought to trial Nazi spies
Nice.
who were getting the codes of cable communications, which were used to go from one ship to another on American ships. And they were put to trial, and a lot of the Nazi spies were able to escape before they could be put on trial or sent to prison. But normally before 1939, 1940, this film would not have been made. But now with World War II happening in Europe, and because it was real, it was a true story, Joseph Breen, who was the censor for the Hayes office, the MPPDA, let it go. However, it was a very difficult, dangerous time. The script was only given to the actors, the cameramen, women, one scene at a time, in order to talk about the script and not to say, well, we're making this film Nazi Confessions, or look at page 25. They used a code word for the script. It was called Hot Lips. The actors who had, a lot of them were from Germany or Austria. If they were bit players, small roles, they didn't want their relatives back in Europe to be hurt, so they didn't give their last name on the credits, or not at all. Obviously, Edward G. Robinson, who was a major FBI player in the film, everyone knew who he was. You know, if he had relatives in Europe, it was just too bad. He was well known.
Yeah.
And the set was under lock and key because they were afraid that the German Bund or other groups that were very pro Third Reich could come in and hurt people or set it on fire, etc. So a difficult time for film as the Third Reich became stronger and stronger. Any questions at all? Yes, Sherry.
I believe you made a reference to Casablanca, and I believe instead of Katharine Hepburn, you mean Ingrid Bergman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
It had to be Ingrid, right?
Thank you. Two great actresses. Yes, Ingrid. Yes.
And
Not Catherine. They don't look at all alike, but
no,
they
they
were
don't.
major stars of the time. Thank you for correcting me.
Sure. And
See
the
that.
other,
But it was Humphrey Bogart. So,
definitely Humphrey and Claude Rains, and
yes.
the keyboardist played against Sam.
Yes.
I forget his name. I've seen it a gazillion times. But the other reference that comes to my mind, when I was a child, there was a movie, I believe it might have been with Frederick March, and I'm not sure who the wife was, Tomorrow the World. Do you remember that? Is that in any part
I've
of
heard
your...
the word. I've heard about it. I
Yeah,
just
it might have been closer to mid 40s, but I do remember my mother taking me to see that film, and then I saw it again subsequently. They had a young boy who was a Nazi living with them or visiting them.
yes.
It was a very...
There were very few American films made about the unfortunate Jewish experience in Europe.
Right.
Very, very few. And even after the war, there were very few films. You had two in 1947 that dealt not with the Holocaust, but with American anti-Semitism. It was Crossfire which was the murder by a anti-Semite GI of a Jewish soldier who just was leaving the military, the American military. And it was basically a detective story of who murdered the Jewish soldier veteran. And then a very famous film from 1947. They both competed for Best Picture, starring Gregory Peck.
Gentlemen's agreement. Yeah.
Gentleman's Agreement. But these films did not mention the Holocaust, and they were made in 1947.
The shocking thing to me about Gentlemen's Agreement when I saw it recently, did you not have a discussion about it in the last few years? No? Did you have a discussion about
Yeah,
Gentlemen's?
well, I have done in the last few years. I don't remember.
Yeah, but the
I
thing
talked about it, yes.
the shock for me in reviewing and seeing it once again, I'd seen it many times before over my lifetime, but what shocked me in looking at it again was how oblique the references were, how everything was so covert. And the other point I wanted to make, Leni Riefenstahl was the subject of a very interesting play at the theater in Berkeley.
Berkeley Rep.
No, the other one.
Oh, okay.
The name is right now flowing out of my head. When Barbara was there in charge, but they did a wonderful kind of a docudrama, because if I remember correctly, it was a drama about her life. And they did show a little bit of film clips of the work she did, because her filmmaking turned out to be very, very avant-garde at the time.
Yes.
And she became a very noteworthy film director.
No, she was, I hate to use the word brilliant. Triumph of the Will is a brilliant piece of Nazi propaganda.
Exactly, yeah.
And it did all the things that Goebbels wanted: a unified community of Aryans, a leader who was superior and looked up to and adored, and a military spirit that was not going to be humiliated on the battlefield, because look, you saw 10,000 or more soldiers who all were united and not defeated. So the interesting thing about Gentlemen's Agreement, even in 47, I won't name the organization because I don't want to put it down. It still exists. There was a Jewish organization that was very worried about having this film made, because they thought if you talked about anti-Semitism, it would encourage anti-Semitism. So therefore, you shouldn't make a film about it. And so they did focus groups with people and to see whether or not they were more anti-Semitic or had more stereotypes after they saw the film. And the answer was no.
Nice.
But there was so much fear, even after the war, because anti-Semitism had increased during World War II. Only in the 50s did it go down. So, any other questions? Anyhow, thank you for joining me.
I have a quick
Yes.
question. The Hepburns, they were not Jewish, were they?
No, you mean Katharine Hepburn?
Yeah.
No, Hepburn, Humphrey Bogart, a whole bunch of them were not Jewish, but they were very against the trials, the HUAC, House of Un-American Activities Committee trials, and were members of a quickly formed organization to protest. And Humphrey Bogart, and then and several other people of that famous level of Hollywood influences flew or went on train to Washington, D.C. to protest. And then they got very scared because the studios for many of these people threatened, maybe we don't want to keep you because you're on the wrong side of the trial.
Yeah.
So, yeah, difficult times. We're in them again. Do research the law firm just recently created where the two leading lawyers who started this new law firm had to resign because people were able to see their horrific, prejudicial, racist, anti-Semitic text messages. You will not believe what they shared. When we think of Breen and others who shared, you know, in conversations or in letters, some horrible things, people are now, you shake your head when you think people are sharing them, one, that they believe them, but also that you would have the audacity to share them in text that could be read by others and think that no one's going to do anything.
Can you name the law firm?
I don't remember it, but if you look, lawyers resign because of racial prejudicial, you'll find it.
Okay.
There were two non-Jewish lawyers who took 100, I think 140 other lawyers with them from an international firm. And the firm that was then left smaller had the right to read the text messages because they were done on the office computers or iPads or whatever. And then they released that information to,
Thank
Yeah.
goodness. That's
and
good.
so now it's public, and it's shocking that of the language used against women, against people of color, and against Jews.
Mhm.
You will not believe it's 2023.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Riva.
Thank you
care.
so much. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.